Hi there, Marie here with the Crafty Cora, and today's video is going to be a fun one for me. I love when two of my passions kind of unite, and in this case it is the love of English history and the Happy Planner. I am an English major, so I love literature and all things England and England history and kings and queens and that type of thing. And so before I got the Happy Planner, I would make lists of things in my iPhone. Things I wanted to remember, just different interesting facts about subjects I was interested in. And so I made a list of the kings and queens of England. And I memorized that list. But the only problem is it only went back to William the Conqueror, which was in 1066. So I thought, you know what, I need to make a new list that goes back kind of to the very beginning with the Saxon kings of England. And I thought, oh, it'd be great just to make a list to put in my Happy Planner. So I'm going to move that out of the way. And basically that's what I'm going to do. So I have a piece of paper that I've already kind of drawn a template on. And I thought it'd be cute to do crowns all over the page and then kind of write the kings and queens in there. There's 60 some odd kings and queens of England, and this is England, of course. Wales and Scotland and parts of Ireland added on and left off throughout the period, but this is going to focus on the ones in England. So I'm going to set this aside. And I'm going to probably speed this part up, but I'm going to go through and draw these out and decorate them a little bit, and then I'll come back and fill them in. Okay, so there are all my crowns colored in, decorated, with their little jewels on them. And real quick, while I erase this, I want to kind of talk about how you can apply this to whatever you're interested in. So even making a to-do list or something like that, if you have kind of if you tend towards the creative side, you can create your to-do list, different elements like this, just anything, flowers or or if you like making lists like I do of things you're interested in, just try to think of a neat way to draw that list, to make that list, to create it. So that's why I just wanted to explain, you know, if you're like, well, I'm not interested in English monarchs or anything like that while you're watching this video, you can use this for anything you're interested in. It's just a neat little way to make a list. Okay, so for a brief crash course in English monarchs, first off, after the Romans left the Isle of Britain and the Anglo-Saxons came and conquered, they kind of divided up the Isle of Britain into these different kingdoms. And a lot of these names you probably recognize, or they are still counties in Britain. So we've got like Mercia, Wessex, Sussex, East Anglia, and so you can see that Britain was kind of divided up, right? Well, the first king of England, the first guy that kind of used that title and combined the forces, was Egbert, and he reigned from 827 to 839, and he was kind of given the ruler of the British, and he ruled all the way up to Northumbria. So I'm going to put him down first, Egbert. And then the son of Egbert was Ethelwulf. He come next. And he was fighting the Danes and all that from invasion. And then the eldest son of Ethelwulf was Ethelbald. And you'll see their names written like this, the combined AE, or you'll see them separate. And then another son of Ethelwulf was Ethelbert. And all these kings reigned over some or all of Britain. There was a lot of invasion at this time. They lost some kingdoms. They gained some kingdoms back. And then another son was Ethelred the first. So these are all Ethelwulf's sons. And he really struggled with the Danes and the Viking kingdoms. And then comes one that probably most everyone knows or recognizes, and that's Alfred the Great. And he was also a son of Ethelwulf. He's the only English king to have the moniker the Great. And historians really feel like he helped to really unite the English, and his reign kind of led to the desire of succeeding kings to want to rule over a united Britain, a united England. And then his son was Edward. and his moniker was the Elder. And the reason why that's important is because later on we will deal with Edward the First, Edward the Second, Edward the Third. So he doesn't fit into that. He's just the Elder. And then the son of Edward the Elder is Ethelstan, or Ethelstan. Just trying to figure out where to put it. And then he was succeeded by his half-brother Edmund. And he reestablished control over northern England. And then next comes another son of Edward the Elder, and it's Edred. And then the son of Edmund succeeds, and he's Edwig. Or Edwig. And then another son of Edmund, who's Edgar. And then the eldest son of Edgar, who was another Edward. And he was the martyr. He succeeded to the throne at just age 12, and then after just 2.5 years as king, he was murdered. They think by his stepmother, so that his half-brother Ethelred II could come to the throne. And he was Ethelred the Unready. And then Sweyn. And Sweyn succeeds to the throne. He was a Dane. He's king of the Danes, and he invaded England. And he ruled for just like 5 weeks. But he was proclaimed king, and then after him, Ethelred the Unready comes back to the throne. But I'm not going to write his name again. So then, son of Ethelred was Edmund II. And he was called Ironside. And then Canute from the Danes, he was a Dane as well, came and conquered, and he made a deal with Edmund Ironside that they would kind of rule together, or that Canute would be his heir, but then Edmund is killed, probably assassinated. So Canute reigns from 1016 to 1035. And then comes Harold I, and he was an illegitimate son of Canute. And he was Harold Harefoot, because he had speed and skill as a hunter. So then his half-brother comes to the throne, and is Harthacnut. And he was the last Danish king to rule England. He died at just age 24. So next comes Edward the Confessor. And he restores the House of Wessex to the throne. And he was very religious and pious and rebuilt Westminster Abbey. So he left no natural successor. Edward the Confessor did not. And so when he died, there was kind of a battle for the throne. Having no royal bloodline, Harold Godwinson was elected king by the council. And so he is next. Some say Godwin, some say Godwinson. So I'm just going to put Godwin because that's all that will fit. And so William, the Duke of Normandy, he was a cousin of Edward the Confessor. He felt like he had a claim to the throne. So he came over and claimed the throne by conquest and killed Harold Godwinson at the Battle of Hastings. So William the First, and put down here Conqueror. And so this begins the Norman kings. So after William the Conqueror was his son, William the Second. And he went on a hunting party with his brother, and he was accidentally shot by a stray arrow. Most people blame his brother, who succeeded him, who was Henry the First. And Henry died of food poisoning, and his only heir was Matilda because his sons had died in a shipwreck, but the council ruled a woman unfit to rule, and so they offered the throne to Stephen, who was a grandson of William the Conqueror. But Matilda held her own. She battled, and she even controlled England for a few months, but she was never proclaimed queen, so that's why she does not make the list. Eventually, Stephen and Matilda make a sort of an agreement that Matilda's son would succeed Stephen, and that is Henry II. And this is the beginning of the Plantagenet kings dynasty. He was from the House of Anjou, which is in France, and he extended his French lands until he really ruled most of France as well as England. He is famous for his quarrel with Thomas Becket, in which Becket was murdered at Canterbury Cathedral, and all of his sons turned against him. This is the father of Richard the Lionheart and Bad King John Lackland, and the Lion in Winter, the movie, and then Shakespeare plays are about him as well. So he is succeeded by his son, Richard the First, who is Richard Lionheart, and he's famous for all his crusades and his battles there and Robin Hood. And he dies. He ruled England for 10 years, but he was only home for like 9 months of it. He was married, but they never produced an heir. So when he died on his way home to England by a stray arrow, he was succeeded by his brother John, who's called John Lackland, or Bad King John. He is considered the worst king in England. It's during this time that the barons rebelled against him and he had to sign the Magna Carta. So he died from dysentery, still kind of on the run from the barons, and he was succeeded by his 9-year-old son, Henry III. And he was brought up by priests. He was very devout. He was captured during a rebellion by the barons and was forced to set up parliament. So this was the beginning of the House of Commons. And then to succeed him was his son, Edward I, who is known as Longshanks and the Hammer of the Scots. And this is the king that features in Braveheart and the William Wallace legends and all of that. And he died on the way to fight Robert the Bruce, the Scotsman who eventually gained freedom from under English tyranny or English rule, or however you want to, whatever view you take on that. And then his son was Edward II, and he was not a very effective king, and he was deposed by his wife and her lover, Mortimer. And so they kind of ruled as regent for the next king, who was a young Edward III. And when Edward III reached majority, he killed Mortimer. He had Mortimer killed, and he took over the reign on his own. His ambition to conquer Scotland and France plunged England into the 100 Years' War, which began in 1338. And Edward III's son, the Black Prince, was very famous for his victories and such. And then also during Edward III's reign, the Black Death occurred, the Great Plague that killed half the population of England. So it was a bad time to be alive during that period. But the Black Prince, who was Edward III's eldest son, he ended up dying. And so after Edward III died, his son, Richard II, came to the throne. And this is important because Edward III had 3 other living sons. And then so on down the line, their descendants start battling for the throne. So Richard II was not a good king either. And there was lots of rebellions. And he was just a very tyrannical king. He was deposed. And Henry Lancaster deposed him, and then he becomes elected Henry IV. And he was one of the descendants of Edward III. And then he seized the crown, and of course he was murdered after he was deposed. And Henry IV was the first one to make his eldest son the Prince of Wales. So this begins the House of Lancaster. And Henry had a hard time hanging on to his throne, and he eventually died, many believe, of exhaustion. And he was succeeded by his son, Henry V, of Shakespearean fame and Battle of Agincourt fame. He defeated the French, a great one-sided victory. And he ended up marrying the daughter of the French king, and there was an agreement that Henry V would inherit the throne of France upon the king's death. He died in battle, campaigning in France, and so his 10-month-old son succeeded him as King of England and France, and this was Henry VI. He was gentle and retiring, and he was a baby when he inherited the throne. They were losing the battle in France with the arrival of Joan of Arc and all that. And so this is kind of the beginning of the War of Roses as well. As Henry gets older, Richard of York, Duke of York, was made protector of the realm, while Henry VI kind of had mental episodes and when he was unfit to rule. And so then Richard kind of battles for the throne. Henry VI is deposed, and Richard's son, Edward IV, comes to the throne because Richard has died in the meantime. And this begins the House of York. Now, Edward IV has a hard time holding on to his crown as well, so he's deposed. Henry VI comes back onto the throne, and then Edward IV finally takes the throne back again. So Edward IV rules for about 20 years. When he kind of dies suddenly, and he leaves two sons. The eldest one is Edward V, and he was 12 years old when his father died. But sadly, he is one of the two princes that was in the tower who disappeared, presumed to be murdered. And the main suspect of this murder was his uncle, Edward IV's brother, who was Richard III. And he succeeded to the crown. But he got his comeuppance when Henry Tudor, across the sea, who had been in exile for a while, decides that Richard doesn't have much support, plus everyone thinks he murdered the young princes in the tower, so he invades, kills Richard at the Battle of Bosworth Field, and then becomes Henry VII and establishes the Tudor dynasty. And he rules for a little while, and then, of course, his son, who comes after him, is Henry VIII. And we all know about Henry VIII and his 6 wives. Divorced, beheaded, died. Divorced, beheaded, survived. And he is succeeded by the son of his 3rd wife, Jane Seymour. And he was Edward VI. Edward was not a very healthy boy. He came to the throne when he was 9, and he ruled for about 6 years. He was a Protestant. He tried to carry on the Protestantism that his father kind of started, but for other reasons. His was for religious reasons. Henry VIII was for marriage reasons. And so before he died, he wanted his cousin, Lady Jane Grey, to succeed him, because his next sister, the next heir, Mary, was a devout Catholic. But Lady Jane Grey was queen for 9 days. She was never confirmed or crowned. And then Queen Mary swoops into London, takes the crown, imprisons Lady Jane Grey, and then later has her and her husband executed. So Mary the First, Bloody Mary is what she's known as a lot, because she really tried to bring the country back to Catholicism, and she burned and killed and beheaded anyone who stood in her way. She was married to Philip of Spain. They could not produce any children, and reluctantly, when she was on her deathbed, she named her half-sister Elizabeth, the daughter of Anne Boleyn, to be queen. And, of course, Elizabeth was, for the most part, a great ruler. She ushered in a golden age in England. And this is a time of Shakespeare and poetry. And it was just a really good time in England. The defeat of the Spanish Armada. The sad point in Elizabeth's reign was the execution of Mary, Queen of Scots, who was her cousin. And Elizabeth I never married, never had children. So the next closest person to succeed her would have been Mary, Queen of Scots' son, and he does so upon Elizabeth's death, and he is James, and he was already King of Scotland, so he was James the First of England, and he was James the Sixth of Scotland. So that's how you see his name, James the First and the Sixth. And this begins the Stuart line, the Stuart dynasty. and he was the first king to rule over England and Scotland. He was more of a scholar than a man of action, and his religious views and such kind of prompted the Pilgrims to leave England and come over to America. His son was Charles I. And he felt he ruled by divine right, which caused problems. And then Civil War broke out. He was captured and beheaded. And then comes the period of the Commonwealth. I'm not going to record the two people that ruled during the Commonwealth because they are not monarchs of England, which is what this is all about. But it was Oliver Cromwell. He ruled under the title Lord Protector, and which basically he was a monarch, though. He kind of ruled over the country. And then he passed it to his son, which was Richard Cromwell. He wasn't well liked, or he wasn't a very effective ruler either. So they invited Charles I's son to come back as monarch, and he is Charles II. Now Charles II comes back as king, and he has quite less powers than his father did. But he's well liked. He was called the Merry Monarch. During this time, the Great Plague kind of come back in 1665, and the Great Fire of London in 1666, which destroyed most of London. But Charles II never married, and so he never had heirs. And so following his death, his brother, James II, comes to the throne. But the problem with James II is he was a Catholic in a Protestant country. And so it did not go over well. He was kind of pushed out of the way. And he had two daughters who were both Protestants. They were raised Protestants, even though he was a Catholic. And so they were invited to take the throne in place of their father. So the first one is Mary. And she was married to William of Orange. So they invited them over to rule jointly. And you usually see them as William and Mary. And he's actually William III. And I guess she would be Mary II. So then they did not have any surviving children either. So James II's second daughter, Anne, Queen Anne, comes to the throne. And what's kind of sad about Queen Anne is she was pregnant 17 times and only had one child to survive. And then he ended up dying before she did at age 11. So that's kind of sad. But the United Kingdom of Great Britain was created during Anne's rule with the official union of England and Scotland. They had been governed by the same king since James I and the Sixth, but they were kind of had different governments and such until this time when they were officially combined. So after Anne's death, the succession went to the nearest Protestant relative of the Stuart line. The Stuarts began here, and they had to skip over a bunch of Catholics. So the next Protestant in line was Sophia, who was who lived in Hanover, and she was the daughter of James I's only daughter. The problem is Sophia died just a few weeks before Anne, so the crown went to her son, George. Now, George was king of Hanover, and he spoke zero English. And he preferred Hanover. He didn't, he wasn't in England very much, and he left the governing to his prime minister, the first prime minister of Britain, who was Sir Robert Walpole. And then the only son of George I is George II. And he had to deal with some uprisings to try to put the Bonnie Prince Charlie on the throne, who was a descendant of James II. And then to succeed him was his grandson, who was George III. And George III is known for as the Mad King. He dealt with the American Independence War, and he also dealt with the Napoleonic Wars. But towards the end of his reign, especially after the American Revolution, he kind of dealt with madness, with periods of insanity, and so his son had to be regent for him, which led to the Regency period. And when his son finally officially comes to the throne, he is known as George IV. And he was his private life was a mess. He had a mistress that he lived with, or he was married, but it wasn't official because it had to be approved through the king. So all those offspring didn't count. He married properly, had one daughter, Charlotte, and England loved Charlotte. She got married, but sadly died during her first pregnancy. So then the throne had to move to another of George III's sons, and he had a lot of sons. He had a lot of children. I want to say at least 15. And this son was called William IV. Now all these sons were getting old, and no one had a clear heir. So in their 50s and whatnot, they had to start marrying younger women to try to produce an heir. Eventually, the fourth son of George III, Edward, Duke of Kent, has a little girl, and her name is Victoria. So she succeeds her uncle upon his death. And we all know Victoria. She married Albert of Saxe-Coburg, had 9 children. She reigned a very long time, only recently surpassed in number of years by the current queen, not our current queen. I kind of feel like I'm a citizen of Britain, but anyways, she reigned a very long time. That time period is given her name, the Victorian era. And so she reigns from 1837 all the way to 1901. She is succeeded by her son, Edward VII, and he gives his name to his time period, the Edwardian era. This was a golden age, a gilded age, lots of house parties and hedonism and just pleasure seeking, that type of thing. It was kind of a direct contrast to the Victorian era. And he ruled from 1901 to 1910. Then his son, George V, comes to the throne, and this is the time of World War I. Victoria was still part of the Hanover house, the Hanover dynasty, and then her son was Saxe-Coburg because his father was Saxe-Coburg, and he took his father's house, so to speak. So George V was part of the Saxe-Coburg house, but then World War I happens. We hate Germany during that period, and so he had to change his name to something that was more British sounding. So George V picked Windsor, the castle of Windsor, the town of Windsor. It was very British sounding. It's a very British name. So from then up into the present day, the monarchy is considered the House of Windsor. So this was the time of World War I. And then when he dies, his eldest son, Edward VIII, succeeds him. And Edward VIII was in love with a divorced American named Wallace Simpson. He only ruled for 9 months, and he decided since he couldn't marry Wallace Simpson, that he would abdicate. So the year is 1936. George V, it's the year of 3 kings. George V dies early in 1936. Edward VIII rules for a few months in 1936, and then at the end of 1936, when he abdicates, he is succeeded by his brother, George VI. Now, George VI never thought he would come to the throne. He was never supposed to come to the throne. He had a stuttering disability. He was kind of nervous, but World War II happens. He had to step up to the plate, and he did a great job of keeping Hitler out of Britain and of giving morale to the people during the bombing of England. But sadly, the stress of it all, and he chain smoked, kind of led to his premature death. And of course, he was succeeded by the current monarch, Elizabeth II. And Elizabeth is the longest ever ruling monarch of England. She has ruled now for 60 some odd years. 67 years this year. So she's the longest reigning monarch ever to rule. And she was the eldest of 2 daughters. That's why she came to the throne. If George VI had had a son, he would have succeeded before her. Now the crown will go to the oldest born child, no matter of gender. So succeeding Elizabeth II will be her son Charles. Succeeding him will be William. And then succeeding William, as long as no one dies or nothing crazy happens in the meantime, will be his son George. And what's interesting is William has 3 kids, George, Charlotte, and Louis. So Charlotte now, because of new laws, not pandering towards gender, she would rule first in case something happened to George in front of Louis. So that's good. The monarchy is evolving and such. But Elizabeth is now on the throne, is currently on the throne. She's 90-some years old, and God save the Queen. So I hope you enjoyed this video. It was really fun to make. I love my list of kings and queens of England. And I'll probably, actually I do need to do that real quick, put a title at the top. And so to do that, I'm going to use my alphabet book here. And I'm just going to put the title of English. I better scoot it over some though. I don't know how much room I'll have, because English Monarchs is kind of a mouthful. So I'll probably speed through this part since this video has been pretty long anyways. Alright, so there you go. English Monarchs, all 60 some odd of them. I hope you enjoyed this video. I hope you'll like and subscribe, and until next time, keep on crafting.